Hello and welcome to the Eastern Front. My name is Yulia Zhozha. I'm director of the Black Sea program at the Middle East Institute, and I teach at Georgetown and George Washington Universities. And I'm joined as always by my colleague Dalibor Rohat, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Our special guest today is Michael Sawkiw, who we will be talking to about what is going on the Hill in connection to Ukraine, supplemental aid, and Western support for Ukraine overall. But until then, on our podcast, we talk about security, politics, and culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. If you enjoy this episode, please consider rating, reviewing, and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And before we get into our conversation on the Hill in Ukraine, let us start with our first segment, the news from the Eastern Front. We've been struggling this week because some weeks there's a lot happening and sometimes there's a lot less happening. But I guess we should start off with the biggest news that has been going on for a while now, and that is the massive measures, unprecedented in this particular context, from the United States Department of Justice and FBI in relation to Russian interference in U.S. elections, and not only, also kind of widespread points towards Europe, but we'll get to that in a second. If we're looking at what we have in connection between Russia and the United States, we have some ample measures. I guess the biggest sum is pointing to a firm in Tennessee run or founded by Trump supporters that has been getting almost $10 million from Russian sources and has distributed it to influencers. But of course, everything we need to contextualize in reference to this campaign. We are all familiar with what has happened in 2016 and the Mueller report out of that, and also the fact that we have from the Biden administration a theme a bit created over the past few weeks, first with information about Iranian interference in elections, cyber, then about China trying to gain influence in the US election process, and now Russia. So Dalibor, how do you see this? Is this something as big and as unprecedented? Will it lead to maybe the other shoe dropping and we'll see more of US figures involved in this, or is it staying just Russian for now?
I mean, I'm struggling to form firmer thoughts on this subject. I mean, it always has been one of the weaknesses of open societies that they open the space for bad actors to make arguments in bad faith with the intention of undermining trust in democracy, in institutions, in manipulating public opinion. But I'm not sure there is a very good answer to that challenge other than, I suppose, transparency and exposing those links whenever they exist. I mean, in this case, Russia paid hundreds of thousands to each of these not particularly talented videographers, podcasters, whatever you want to call them, opinion journalists, to produce content that was friendly to Russia. The question is, how much of a difference was that particular operation going to make in the context of the electoral competition here? Probably wasn't terribly consequential, I imagine, and there is obviously an ecosystem of similar influencers, opinion journalists, whatever you want to call them, who operate quite independently of Russian money and are able to monetize on the sort of grievances and steering of this content. But that's something that I suppose our democracies have to live with. I think that the more we know about these flows and the presence of foreign actors and sort of outright bad faith operators, the better. But I don't think it's going to solve the fundamental political issue, which is there is a big segment of the electorate, both in the United States and also in Europe, in places like Germany, where these messages resonate, whether they are coming from Russia-paid actors or not. And I think that's something that centrist, moderate politicians have to reflect on and adjust to. There is another layer to this, which is sort of more direct interference, cyber attacks, and other sort of operations aimed at disrupting democracy. And I think we have to sort of think about in that context of deterrence and possibilities of retaliation. But that's almost subject for another conversation than sort of flows of dirty money into opinion journalism.
Yeah, I also wonder to what extent we can draw parallels between, of course, like you said, we shouldn't be surprised about attempts towards election interference, softer or harder, from Russia, and not only. But I wonder to what extent we have to give more profound thought to the overlap on the political spectrum. It seems to me that in 2016, we had Russia trying to reach out to create division on fringes generally. But now, so far, of course, it might be incomplete and it might be political here too. But so far, the news here has been that Russia has been probing into investing into the area that it deems as most vulnerable or most open to its arguments, which is the right, the far right, as an umbrella term in the United States. And then I wonder what parallels we can draw to Europe, where we have just as much a rise of the far right, but we also have much less discussed a rise of the far left. We alluded to that a little bit last week when we were talking about the results of the elections in Eastern German states. And Politico is adding to it with one of their titles being FBI dossier reveals Putin's secret psychological warfare in Europe. Not sure how secret it is. I think at this point everybody knows about it. But psychological warfare is a new dimension given to the political spectrum. So I wonder if at all we have to see the Kremlin's, and not only Russia's, but in that category's efforts as being adapted and smarter, more differentiated, more targeted, or very similar to what we've seen in 2016 and beyond. Dalibor, does this look either in the United States or in Europe different to you?
I mean, I wouldn't be inflating the intelligence and thoughtfulness that supposedly goes into these activities on the Russian side. I think the Kremlin and Putin are by default opportunistic. Right, they try a million different things, and out of those million things, some work and some others don't. And it doesn't matter terribly, where those things sort of land on the political spectrum. Perfectly happy to make business with German social democrats for as long as that worked. Now perfectly happy to fund the far right, far left, and anybody, in between, from, say, Tulsi Gabbard. If, I'm not using that as an example. I'm not accusing her of receiving Russian money, but, she wouldn't surprise me if she were one of those people. So I think it's totally opportunistic, and clearly these messages have been landing more successfully on the sort of fringes of the Republican Party, if we can still call them fringes. I mean, in the sort of MAGA world. So there is a vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who's openly pro-Russian, and there is, a cohort of pro-Russian members of both houses of Congress, including, unfortunately, the Senate, sort of Ron Johnsons of the world, and there is, mercurial owner of a social media platform who's also openly pro-Russian, and so it's not surprising that that's where the effort is going to be channeled towards, and that those are the people and the constituencies that the Russians will try to work with. But I wouldn't be looking for sort of like deep ideological alignment. Rather, these are more than anything accidents of history. I don't think J.D. Vance had deep-seated views about Russia and Ukraine before the issue really arose as a salient one.
Not really. The one thing that I think hasn't made it as much to the news, but I think it's worth giving some more thought to, it certainly is on my mind, is we have now, I stopped counting, the 7th, 8th instance of Russian, possibly Iranian-made drones showing up in NATO airspace, specifically in Romania, and specifically people have gotten onto the information so far. No one has been hurt. That's lucky. But what has been figured out in the meantime with so many instances has been that Russia is launching these for a distance and for a duration into NATO airspace so that they have a better angle from which to then attack Ukrainian ports. And not only, but Ukrainian territory, which means that on the NATO side, our radars see it and pick it up. And over the past few days, in the latest incident, the situation has been that F-16s have been scrambled and have essentially escorted that Russian drone for tens of miles until the Russians have decided to launch it from NATO airspace onto Ukraine. Romania has not shut it down. It claims that we do not have in Romania the legislation that permits shooting them down. That's probably an excuse. Everybody has gotten onto that because it's now the 7th or 8th time that this is happening. But one of the issues, it's not making it in the news, just like repeated attacks on Ukrainian territory per se, including on civilian targets, do not make it into the news. And the other question that we have to ask ourselves is, how much does it cost us, and how much do different scenarios cost us? But just the scrambling of F-16s and escorting of Russian drones along or within NATO territory is quite a piece of news to digest.
Couple of things. First of all, I think any country is perfectly entitled to shoot objects down that are not supposed to be there, right? Like it's Romanian airspace. Russian drones have no business being there. The question is whether the sort of failure to do so is on purpose, whether it's driven by, I suppose, economic motivations, like knowing that those drones don't pose a threat to Romania and shooting them down with limited supplies of munitions, which tend to be very sort of expensive systems, would just not be economical. I think for good measure, it would be useful if somebody actually had the guts to shoot down a few of these things, just to force the conversation in Washington and perhaps build the case for Kiev not only shooting these things down, but also targeting the places where these things are coming from, because I think that's the big challenge at hand. I don't know the details of the Romanian situation. We've seen incidents in Poland where drones and airplanes, etc., have been entering the airspace and leaving the airspace as part of their operations against Ukraine. Obviously, this is very brazen behavior from the Russians, and if we know anything about the Russians, is that it will continue and it will get worse until somebody puts an end to it. And I wish that happens sooner rather than later.
Indeed, something to add to our list of to-do things on the Eastern Front.
Let us now turn to the second segment and talk to our guest, Michael Sawkiw, the director of Ukrainian National Information Service in Washington, D.C. Michael, it's great to have you. Why don't you kick us off first by telling us a little bit about what your organization does, what its aims are, and what role it has played in recent years in building up support for Ukraine in the United States.
Absolutely, Dalibor. Yulia, thank you very much for this invitation for the Eastern Front podcast. My name is Michael Sawkiw. As Dalibor had mentioned, I am the director of the Ukrainian National Information Service, which is the public affairs bureau in Washington, D.C. of the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America, which is a representative organization of the 2+ million Ukrainian American community. Interestingly enough, the UCCA was formed in 1940 as a way of coordinating the displaced peoples of World War II, the Ukrainians that had come over from Europe, from Ukraine in particular, to the United States. And interestingly enough, now in 2022, we too had to do a lot of coordination when it came to the refugees of the latest war of Russian aggression against Ukraine. So there are 250,000 plus new Ukrainian refugees in the United States on the U4U program. And we're very proud that we are interacting with them, that they are interacting with us as a larger Ukrainian community. They're getting involved in our networks, whether it's churches, whether it's community organizations, civic organizations, as well as our very large financial base that we have here within the United States. So given all of that, it also helps us in terms of the advocacy that we do. And this is the most important and key part of our component in Washington, D.C., is the advocacy. We are advocating, obviously, on behalf of the Ukrainian American community as American citizens for the best of U.S. foreign policy and national security interests when it comes to Ukraine. It's quite obvious for the past 2.5 years, our intent is to provide Ukraine with as much military support as possible to fend off the Russian aggressor, and obviously to come back to the borders of 1991, where Ukraine and the rest of the world at the United Nations had claimed it to be in terms of its territorial integrity. So a lot has happened in the past 33 years of Ukraine's independence since 1991. A lot more has happened, unfortunately, since 2014, the first Russian invasion with its annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine and Donbass, and obviously since February 24th of 2022.
So let me ask you then a little bit about how that's going right now. You already alluded to the fact that, of course, things have gotten much more complex in the last 2.5 years, and we've gone a long way here too, from talking about whether javelins are escalatory to delivering comprehensive packages at some point in a rhythm of once a month. I remember last year when we were looking through the news, we were always waiting for a certain date date or around a certain date, and what kind of packages would the Ukrainians get. We're now 2/3 into 2024, and the first part was a battle, an uphill battle about getting the supplemental through. Maybe you can mention a little bit about how you perceive that on your end of the work. I can't imagine how much that work has meant, but what we see only bits and pieces of in the news as Ukraine has disappeared from the front pages from last fall, really, is the fact that we don't get supplemental drawdown sufficiently, certainly in comparison, it seems like, with the rhythm from last year. And it's not clear to me what the whole picture of this is, how bad the situation is. So would you be able to recall a little bit of the context of the beginning of 2024 with this specific supplemental, and then tell us how things are going and what the challenges are from getting the money from the supplemental all the way to getting the equipment and the ammunition to the front lines?
Yeah, it's a great question, Yulia. In terms of the supplemental itself, actually, there are two big heavy lifts from us as a Ukrainian American community. First, it came in terms of a 6-month battle in Congress from October of 2023, when the president requested a supplemental for Ukraine in the amounts of $60 billion, to April of 2024, when it finally passed both chambers of the United States Congress. That heavy lift was a matter of looking at it from the perspective of both political parties. I would say the majority of both political parties are in favor of continued support for Ukraine, but maneuvering, unfortunately, around several key congressional folks to make sure that that assistance actually did happen. And we were very fortunate that it was done on a very large and wide-scale bipartisan effort. However, that's not the end of it. April of 2024, in a sense, was just the beginning of the next battle, and the next battle, obviously, on how to disperse and distribute the $60 billion that was appropriated by Congress. So 7.8, close to $8 billion was appropriated within the bill for what is called presidential drawdown authorities. For the president has the authority, and administration has the authority to take armaments from our stockpiles and deliver them for Ukraine. It's wonderful that that authority exists, but one of the unfortunate aspects is that that authority will expire as of September 30th of this year. So in less than a month, in 3.5 weeks, that particular authority now will expire. What does that mean in terms of expiring? So far, to date, since the April 2024 supplemental, the United States has withdrawn $1.6 billion of that close to $8 billion presidential drawdown authority. So we're left with about $6 billion that still needs to be used. I don't want to say much as we say in the United States when it comes to vacation, you either lose it or lose it. But at the same time, this is almost the same type of analogy that we're sharing right now, is that first off, Ukraine needs the military armaments. There's no question about it. It needs a wide range of military armaments, whether it's the HIMARS, whether it's the ATACMS, whether it's the 155 millimeter shells, and so forth and so on. Ukraine needs all of this. Ukraine needs the Patriot missile systems. What is of concern is making sure that that $6 billion that's still left in the pot is appropriated, or I should say it's already been appropriated, but is already allocated. There are two ways of making sure that it's allocated. First off is the administration through the State Department can send a notification to Congress to say, thank you very much for your appropriations, for your $7.8 billion. We intend to use the remaining $6 billion in terms of X, Y, and Z when it comes to various armaments. Or Congress can step in as well and extend with a law, with a bill that extends the presidential drawdown authorities. That's something right now that we as the Ukrainian community are very concerned about. We're grateful to this administration for everything that the administration has done, obviously in the past 2.5 years. But if we lose this capability right now for Ukraine getting this desperately needed weaponry, what's to say how easy or not easy it will be in future? Should there be a second supplemental? Should there be anything in the future that provides Ukraine as well with presidential drawdown authorities from our particular stockpile? So I think that's key right now. And again, this is a heavy lift. Conversations are already being had with relevant members of Congress, with relevant committees. Obviously, conversations are also being had with administration officials to make sure that that particular drawdown authority on September 30th truly does not expire.
If I may follow up just very quickly, why do you think that is? How do you make sense of that? That on the one hand, we had this insistence from October, like you mentioned, from the White House, and now the White House has decided to leave it to the last minute, and we're not sure if they're going to go through with it?
I think this is a matter of the administration in consultation with the Ukrainians as to A, what is available in terms of our stockpiles, getting it to Ukraine in a timely manner, and what is necessary at said moment. So I would hope that of the various discussions that have been had, with President Zelensky being in Washington for the 75th anniversary of the NATO summit, that these relevant types of conversations were had. I know the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, as well as the Chief of Staff of the President, were in Washington, D.C. late last week before the Labor Day holiday, and also discussing this, as well as the opportunity for deep strikes of the American weaponry that is given to Ukraine to have deep strikes within Russia. So I think it's just a matter of semantics. I don't want to say that it's as simple as that, but I'm hoping, again, from the information that is given to me, I'm hoping that this is something that the administration just needs to put pen to paper to allocate this and make sure by September 30th that Ukraine does receive all the relevant weaponry that it so desperately needs.
The broader issue, though, is that $60 billion sounds like a lot of money, but it's not going to cover Ukraine's needs indefinitely. So let's say we get into late this year, early next year, there'll be a new Congress. How do you see the path towards another supplemental bill evolving in the coming months? Shall we sort of follow the same model as before? Is there any possibility of folding Ukraine aid into the defense authorization bill, or are we sort of stuck with passing these supplementals? And how do you also see the politics of this play out? Obviously, that's a speculative question, given that we don't know what the election will look like, but I think we have to prepare for all contingencies. So what are the sort of scenarios that worry you, and what are you trying to prepare for?
I see this almost in a two-pronged scenario. First prong, obviously, is looking at it from the perspective of the average American. First of all, the United States, in terms of its assistance to Ukraine, and not just to Ukraine, it's any type of foreign assistance given to any country, is there for a purpose. And looking at it from that perspective, the average American that knowingly supports Ukraine because they see them, in a sense, being the quote-unquote underdog. They're the underdog in this fight, glacial fight, if anything else like that, from second largest army of the world, supposedly, against a small Ukrainian army. Yet at the same time, for 2.5 years, Ukraine, in terms of its innovation and resilience, has withstood this second greatest army of the world in this paper tiger. But looking at it from the specifics of moving forward, it's that paper tiger, and it's also that resilience and that innovation of the Ukrainians that have been given this weaponry from the United States and from other Western allies as well. The Ukraine has had the opportunity to withhold the Russians for this period of time. That also shows that the weaponry that is given to the Ukrainians from the United States is being put to great use. And I think looking at it from that perspective is my communities throughout the United States are interacting with various other communities, whether it's the Jewish community, whether it's other Central and East European communities, the Cuban community, understanding the Venezuelan community, understanding what dictatorship, authoritarianism is all about, and making sure that we all signify that particular resolve for us as Americans through our members of Congress, that this is important for U.S. foreign policy. And for that reason, looking forward to the future, whether there is going to be a second supplemental within a lame duck Congress between the election and the end of the congressional session on December 31st, or looking at something in a new Congress come January of 2025. This is an opportunity for us to continue. Unfortunately, unless the war ends tomorrow, and that meaning that Russia obviously gets out of Ukraine and provides Ukraine with all of its territory back, this war might go on for yet a few more months. And it's necessary to make sure that Ukraine is victorious in this, because this is unforeseen. It's unforeseen that we're, in a sense, kind of normalizing or trying to normalize war in Europe, what is happening on a daily basis in Ukraine. We cannot do that anymore. We cannot normalize rockets and missiles being launched against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, killing civilians almost on a day-to-day basis, at least in the past 4 or 5 days, that this is being normalized. And this cannot be normalized, because unfortunately, it's not just civilians that are on the front lines here, it's democracy as a whole that's on the front lines here.
The sad truth, though, is that for many Americans, I'm afraid to say, and it's a horrifying thought, Ukraine has almost become kind of a background noise that they sort of live with and see in through a very abstract set of lenses. And I think the challenge for people who do think that Ukraine matters is to kind of drive home the scale of Russian atrocities and the downside scenario for Europe and for American security as well. well should Ukraine lose this war. And I wish I knew how to do that job better.
Well, that was done, Dalibor. That actually was done as part of our 6-month heavy lifting when it came to the supplemental fight between October of last year to April of this year. It was in the background. Unfortunately, it's not on the front pages anymore of the Washington Post, of the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times. It may be on the back pages, second, third, or further in. But at the same time, there are all of these atrocities that are happening on a day-to-day basis. In particular, what truly helped us when it came to that 6-month heavy lifting of the supplemental earlier this year was the persecution of Ukrainian Christians. The persecution of Ukrainian Christians in Ukraine's occupied territories by those Russians affects the Baptist churches, affects the evangelical community, affects the Jewish community, affects the Muslim community, affects the Catholic community, the greater Orthodox community, and so forth. So that also brought this almost to a context of the average American saying there is persecution going on in Ukraine. It's not just on a day-to-day basis of rockets being fired, but it's also what's happening to the people in those occupied territories that are constantly seeing these types of crimes against humanity and war crimes being perpetrated and committed.
We've also seen that with the election campaign sort of building up, right? We're now almost in the middle of it, kind of intellectually, or how we feel about it here in the United States, that for good or for bad reasons, and you'll tell us some of both, I'm guessing, Ukraine has not been a matter of debate. Now, foreign policy is difficult to be a matter of debate, and maybe there's big disadvantages to it. But the reality is that here on this podcast and in many other places, we would love to know more about how the candidates plan to deal strategically with Ukraine, right? There's a lot of unknown parts on both sides. Now, on September 4th, we had a big piece of news from the FBI that has released information that is now going across the international and Western media space vis-a-vis both Europe and the United States. And unsurprisingly, to any of us that have been following, Russian attempts for election interference here in the United States. And the narrative, whether it's in Europe or it is here, is the same, is undermining support for Ukraine, either directly or indirectly, and increasing possible support or less of opposition to Russia. I wonder if with this piece of news coming in, you think that Ukraine will become more of a theme in the political context that we're in here in the United States, whether either the Democrats or the Republicans will be more forced to pick it up as a topic in the context of course, a major issue of Russian election interference after already news of Chinese attempts and Iranian attempts in the last week.
Yeah, this obviously with the news coming from the Department of Justice yesterday from the FBI in terms of the 2 Russian nationals that have been charged, sanctions that have been slapped upon 10, I think it were Russian officials, as well as various types of internet domains that were taken down. It also shows that this war is not just a kinetic war. This is not just a war about rockets being fired onto civilian targets in Ukraine. This is also a disinformational war. And whether yesterday's FBI and Department of Justice claims that came about is just a matter of that disinformation war and the Russians trying to sow that type of discord here in the United States. Those specifically did not mention Ukraine per se, but obviously this was an opportunity to try to show that either one political party or another political party would be better with a Russian form of government or better in terms of world politics than the opposing side. This, we have to fight with as much measure as possible. This is something that even we from the Ukrainian community, ever since 2014, frankly speaking, ever since Ukraine declared its independence from then the USSR, the disinformation campaign is just another facet and another arm of the Kremlin that is used constantly. One of the inspiring things about yesterday's claims, and coming from the FBI and the Department of Justice, is that I'm hoping that this signals to other allies of the United States that they too must scrutinize what is happening within their societies, because this is not just about the United States. It's not just about the US election. Yes, right now it is pervasive as we're heading into 60 plus days for the election itself, but other countries have been and are dealing with the same type of problems. So I'm hoping that this is a coordinated campaign from all the democracies throughout the world, from the community of democracies, so to say, and that this is something that can be fought continuously, not just as a one-time deal here. I must say the same thing with sanctions. On August 24th, the State Department slapped several sanctions on Russian entities, on other European and other worldwide entities that have been harboring and or providing assistance to Ukraine. Yulia, you had mentioned this earlier in terms of any types of PDAs, the Presidential Drawdown Authorities, when it comes to armaments, would come around a significant type of holiday or something towards the end of a month or something of significance when it comes to Ukrainian history. August 23rd is Ukrainian Flag Day, but it's also a day before Ukraine's independence on August 24th. Let's not have to wait until those significant dates to slap sanctions on Russian entities. Let's not have to wait until something truly tragic, again, I should say, because unfortunately on a daily basis, it's a tragic story that's happening in Ukraine. Not have to wait until something truly outrageous has to happen in Ukraine for these types of sanctions and or other types of actions to happen. So I welcome yesterday's claims from the FBI and from the Department of Justice. I just hope that other countries will take suit, follow that lead, and then we can come to a better understanding of truly what Russian disinformation and their propaganda machine is all about.
I will just add, because we are recording this podcast in several stages on different days, that yesterday in this particular case refers to the 4th of September. Michael, thank you so much for joining us on the Eastern Front and for sharing your views with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So now we're turning to our third segment, that of recommendations that we have for you, looking onto what people are writing, thinking about, putting out in terms of Eastern Front relevant issues. And this time it comes from me, and specifically it's a longer piece that I'm not expecting everyone to read in detail, but it's at least worth skimming through, if not reading. It's in the summer issue of the Texas National Security Review, a piece by Phil Zelikow on the confronting another axis, history, humility, and wishful thinking. And the reason why I'm pulling this out is that in the last couple of years, we have started collectively thinking about strategic competition in terms of sides and whether the other side is cooperating. And if it is cooperating, what does that mean for us? And I think Zelikow's piece is one that for the first time maps out a bunch of things that are interesting to me and that are worth exploring, giving some thought to, and perhaps even further developing. He maps out, first of all, the adversarial patterns that we're looking at over the past few years. We have tended for decades now in our strategic thinking in Washington to see separately the China issue, the Russia issue, the Iran issue, and beyond, even though in front of our eyes they're enhancing their what they call strategic cooperation. And Zelikow really maps that out and then draws some very useful parallels to different axes that we had to confront, of course, during World War II, but then also in the post-Cold War era. And he's making the argument that we have made so often on the Eastern Front that we haven't really figured out this mapping of adversarial forces, because what they're doing, and of course Zelikow is not the only one that is pointing to that, but he does it so comprehensively. What they're doing is essentially building and enforcing and consolidating alliances aimed at creating division, attacking, whatever verb you'd like to use, the West collectively, the United States primarily, and then its allies. And so while in this piece specifically of Zelikow, he does not point necessarily to the solutions, he draws out or maps out some parallels, some historical parallels that should help us get beyond what he is describing very usefully as this lack of strategic thinking. And specifically, he argues that with what we have now in Washington and beyond, we're not necessarily strategically thinking, but we are reacting the whole time. And that in order to devise a strategy that anticipates instead of react, we first have to understand what the patterns are of our adversarial forces. So that's my recommendation for this week.
So I haven't read the piece. I look forward to reading the piece, but I will say that the overall picture as you presented it rings true. But at the same time, I think it's worth not overestimating the ability of our adversaries to cooperate. So it is striking to me that despite the existence of the no limits partnership between China and Russia, despite the non-cooperation of much of the global south with the sanctions regime and efforts to hold Putin accountable, we haven't really seen the emergence of anything remotely similar to the Cold War era system of sort of alliances and formalized cooperation that existed between Soviet bloc countries, that there is no effort to sort of build an institutional architecture for something that would be an alternative to the US-led international order. So it's really sort of nihilistic exercise almost by Beijing and Moscow to try to just be difficult, make things dysfunctional, but not really offer anything useful instead. And you see that even on very basic things, you would think that China would do more to help Russia cope with the sanctions regime besides just sending them stuff. I mean, when you look at the investment flows from China to Russia, those are very small and have come almost to a standstill during the war. And Chinese banks themselves are oftentimes quite wary of secondary sanctions from the US. I'm saying that not to kind of praise the Chinese, but only to point out that we have leverage, even in situations where we think we don't. And we very often choose not to use that leverage. Before we wrap up though, I wanted to, I suppose, just spare a thought, pay homage to a Telegraph journalist, David Knowles, who passed unexpectedly this weekend. He was in his early 30s, very energetic. He was the producer and the co-host of the Ukraine Today podcast, published by the Daily Telegraph on a daily basis. It's been an amazing, monumental achievement. It's been a great resource for everybody who follows the war in Ukraine. I think this was an unexpected blow to his colleagues. I can't imagine what his family is going through. So I just wanted to remember David. He came through AEI last year at some point with his colleague Francis Durnley. They did interview AEI's president Robert Doar. I didn't know him well, but clearly he will be missed. And I want to just say for the record that his work and the work of his colleagues at the Telegraph's Ukraine Today podcast just has been very meaningful to many people around the world. And David will be missed and remembered by us all.
Indeed, condolences, and we cannot imagine what the family and colleagues are going through. His work will be missed on our end too. Thank you for listening to The Eastern Front, a podcast dedicated to security, politics, and the culture of Eastern Europe and their continued relevance to the United States. As always, you can find our podcast in the usual places. And until next time, thank you and goodbye.